Okay, good morning. I believe people are getting on. Welcome to this panel on stratification and COVID-19. This is a panel that is co-sponsored by the Association for Social Economics, as well as the International Association for Feminist Economics. We look forward to a really interesting discussion with 5 closely related papers on stratification and COVID-19. And starting off this morning, I'll introduce each paper one by one, and we will go straight from one paper to the next. Each paper presenter will take 15 minutes, and we will have the discussants go after all the papers. And then after the discussants, we will open it up to Q&A. So if you are a participant, if you could please enter your questions in the Q&A, our panelists can respond either in a written answer or any answers that are still remaining outstanding at the end, we will discuss verbally. And hopefully we can have a lively discussion in this rather constrained virtual environment. So to start us off is Ofronama from BU from the New School with her co-authored paper with Darrick Hamilton, also from the New School, on race, gender, and occupational crowding in the time of COVID-19. Ofronama, you are on.
Hopefully that's working.
Not yet. Did you do share screen? There we go.
Great. Thank you so much. To start us off, in April of 2020, shortly after the pandemic started, we know the unemployment rate was the highest it's been since the Great Depression at 14.7%. The Black unemployment rate in April was 14.2%, and the white rate was, the Black unemployment rate was 16.7%, the white rate was 14.2%, which is different from what we're accustomed to, where the Black unemployment rate is usually twice that of their white counterparts. However, by October, the white unemployment rate was down to 7.9%, and the Black rate was almost twice that at 13.2%. So we're back to the norms we've seen before. Another issue, of course, is the health impact of the pandemic. There have been over 350,000 deaths in the US from COVID-19, and the CDC reports that Black, Latinx, and Native American populations have a COVID-19 mortality rate more than twice that of white people. So this economic crisis is unlike many recent recessions because in addition to the harms of unemployment, in many cases, those who continue to work are at higher risk of illness and death due to COVID-19 exposure. In this paper, we examine how race and gender groups are differentially exposed to the risk of COVID-19 in essential work, as well as occupations with high physical proximity to colleagues and customers. We look at Black women, Black men, Latinx women, Latinx men, white women, and white men. Occupational crowding, introduced by Barbara Bergman, measures the degree to which workers are over, under, or proportionally represented in occupations based on their race and the prerequisite educational requirement for particular roles. As shown here, we divide the actual share of workers in the role by the expected share, which is only those who qualify for the role based on educational criteria. And when occupations are composed of more than 10% of the expected number of the group, that's considered to be cases of overrepresentation, while occupations with less than 10% of the expected number of the relevant group are considered to be cases of underrepresentation. When the expected number of the relevant group doesn't exceed nor is less than 10%, it's considered to be proportional representation. Numerous researchers have documented occupational crowding based on race. For instance, studies have shown Black men are crowded into lower wage roles and crowded out of high wage roles, even when they have the educational requirements for those positions. On the other hand, white men are crowded into high wage roles, meaning there are white men who are underqualified but in these positions, and they are also crowded out of low wage roles generally. So we extend the same methodology used on occupations to essential work and high physical proximity work. We count as eligible for a particular type of work only those individuals whose educational attainment fits between the 20th and 80th percentiles of the educational distribution for those in that category. And reflecting on Mary King's access model that puts forward the social hierarchy where white men have the most access to desirable jobs, for most of our analyses, white men are positioned as the reference to which we compare these different groups. And when focusing on white men, we compare them to a baseline of all workers in the economy to measure their degree of advantage overall. We also add Black women and Latinx women in comparison to white women to isolate the effects of race, especially in gendered work. So there's no one definition of essential work. For this analysis, we modified essential work categories established by Celine McNicholas, Margaret Poydok's Economic Policy Institute report on essential workers and unionization. We used 2018 ACS data to determine sectors and assess crowding. After some modifications, we ended with 13 essential sectors based on combinations of census occupations and industries. The essential sectors employing the most workers include healthcare, food and agriculture, transportation, warehouse and delivery, and commercial services. So it's been well reported that essential work is dominated by workers of color, especially women of color, and this presentation will look at whether this is the case of occupational crowding. So does the share of race and gender of workers by race and gender exceed expectations based on educational attainment? We also delve further into to see how essential work crowding varies by wage and by risk. So first, we estimate 44% of workers fall into an essential sector. And as shown here, more than half of Black workers are in essential work, while the same could be said for less than half of white workers. In terms of both race and gender, Black women are most likely to be in an essential role, followed by Latinx men, then Black men. Here we show the occupational crowding indices for essential work in any of the 13 essential sectors. So the crowding index is greater than 1.1, it's a case of overrepresentation, and less than 0.9, it's underrepresentation. Between 0.9 and 1.1 is proportional. So we find that white men are crowded out of essential work even after considering the educational levels of each race and gender group. And in comparison to white men, Black women, Latinx women, Black men, and Latinx men are crowded into essential work. White women are proportionally represented in essential work with a crowding index of 1.0, and also Latinx women and Black women are crowded into essential work as compared to white women as well. All groups, with the exception of white men, earn below average annual wages, with Latinx women and Black women earning the least in both essential work and also, by the way, non-essential work. So in essential work, Latinx women earn 54 cents on the dollar, while Black women earn 61 cents. Latinx men earn 68 cents, Black men 69 cents, and finally, white women earn 83 cents. And white men earn 130% of average wages in essential work. This last column shows the severity of the wage inequality. So within essential work, the highest paying work is dominated by white men. So we identify more than 400 unique occupations within the 13 essential sectors. We estimated bivariate regressions of average occupational wages measured in $10,000 increments on occupational crowding so that we could examine the relationship between crowding and wages across the various essential worker occupations. So as shown here, for example, for every $10,000 increase in average occupational wages, for Black and Latinx women respectively, there's an estimated 16 percentage point reduction in their representation in each essential occupation category relative to white men. There are declines for the other groups, and conversely, there's a positive relationship between wages and crowding for white men as compared to all workers in the economy, as the average wages of a particular occupation increased by $10,000, the estimated proportion of white men rises by 7 percentage points, and all these findings were statistically significant. So to summarize, not only are white men less exposed to COVID as a result of their underrepresentation in essential work, they also tend to work in occupations with higher wages when they are employed as an essential worker. On the other hand, Black and Latinx women in particular are not only more likely to be sorted into essential work and have more exposure, but they are sorted into essential worker occupations that receive the lowest wages. The food and agriculture sector is worthy of particular scrutiny. In our analysis, the sector has the lowest average annual wages of any essential sector. And we know that advocates and researchers have spotlighted the dangers facing workers in that sector, including deplorable working conditions, limited personal protective equipment, low pay, and few benefits. And we know that many of these workers have contracted COVID-19. We find that Latinx women and men, and to a lesser degree, Black men are crowded into the sectors compared to white men. White men are underrepresented in food and agriculture and still earn 30% above average wages in the sector. We decided to disaggregate by citizenship status for Latinx workers. So for example, non-citizen Latinx women are 250% more likely than white women and 290% more likely than white men to work in food and agriculture. In contrast, Latinx women who are citizens are nearly proportionally represented with white women and just 20% more likely to work in food and agriculture than white men. Latinx women who are not citizens also receive significantly lower wages than citizens relative to both white men, just 50% of average wages for non-citizens compared to 64% for citizens, and also as compared to white women. In comparison, white men, Latinx men who are not citizens are 250% more likely to be in the food and agriculture sector and earn 71% of average wages when they are in that sector. Latinx men who are citizens are still overrepresented, more likely to be in the sector by 30% as compared to white men, and earn 84 cents on the dollar. We next examine race and gender differences in essential work sorting by extent of possible exposure to COVID-19. Even more. So within the category of essential work, some workers would be at even greater risk due to their proximity to other workers and customers. So we use listings of physical proximity from the U.S. Department of Labor, Employment and Training Administration's ONET online. And we designated occupations that had a rating of 75 and above, which is moderately close, at arm's length or closer, as high physical proximity, and all others as low physical proximity. We then crosswalked these occupations to the ACS data, and we found that 20% of occupations that fell into one of the 13 essential sectors had high physical proximity, and the majority of these were in healthcare. So looking at essential work.
You're at 10 minutes and you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you. So looking at essential work with high physical proximity across all occupations in this category, only white men were underrepresented and also earned the highest share of average wages again, while Black women earned the lowest share of average wages and were overrepresented in essential work with high physical proximity. Black women and Latinx women had the highest average crowding scores, 2.2 for both, making them 120% more likely to occupy these roles than white men. Black women were also overrepresented compared to white women, but here earn almost a proportional share of wages in essential work with high physical proximity, while Latinx women were proportional as compared to white women. Black men, Latinx men, and white women were also overrepresented in essential work with high proximity to others. So as the pandemic recedes, state and local governments have been allowing various businesses to resume operations. Some remote workers have returned to in-person work, even if they weren't considered essential before. As the country continues to, quote unquote, reopen, many more workers could be at heightened risk of contracting COVID-19. So to explore this risk, we classified all occupations, both non-essential and essential, to high physical proximity and low proximity. And of the over 400 occupations that were matched to ONET, 26% had high physical proximity to colleagues and our customers. So these roles include things like occupations in healthcare, but also non-essential roles like hairdressers and waiters and waitresses. And as shown here, occupations of the high physical proximity category have average wages are 21% lower than those with less proximity to others. So what does that sorting look like? So white men are underrepresented in high physical proximity occupations as compared to everyone else. So this crowd index is even lower than what we've explored before. When they are in these roles, they receive 40% higher wages. All groups in comparison white men, with the exception of Black men who are proportionally represented, are crowded into occupations with high physical proximity. Crowding index is highest for Black women, who are 80% more likely than white men to be in an occupation with high physical proximity, followed by Latinx women, who are 70% more likely to be in this work. And again, Black women earn 63 cents on the dollar in this work compared to white men, and for Latinx women, that number is just 57%. The wage disparity is especially the case with higher paying occupations that happen to fall in high physical proximity work, and that's the case of That's what we've seen in other examinations of occupational crowding. So for example, as physicians, Black women earn 67% of average wages compared to white men, and Latinx women who are physicians earn 60%, while white men earn 118%. But it's something like home health aides that has a really low average salary, under 25,000. Black women earn 96% of average wages, Latinx women 90%, white men 138%. So they're able to earn a more proportional amount in these lower paying occupations, but again, still white men still significantly out earn them. I'll also add that Black women and Latinx women are proportionally represented compared to white women in high proximity occupations, still are earning lower wages. So to conclude, the 2020 recession, like others before, is marked by inequity across race and gender, even among those with high levels of education. Although in this case, harms include both unemployment and increased risk of sickness and death. Black women, Black men, Latinx women, Latinx men, and white women are overrepresented either in essential work with high physical proximity, and also work with high physical proximity generally, or all three, and are thus can be at greater risk of contracting COVID-19. So not only are some race and gender groups more exposed to the virus, but when they are in these positions, they also are paid less than white men, and for Black women and Latinx women, in many cases, paid less than white women. So the Department of Labor and its Occupational Safety and Health Administration has offered a few guidelines to employers how to protect workers, and healthcare unions are suing OSHA and the current labor secretary for their failure to protect workers. Essential workers need more support, including safety guidelines for and oversight of employers, personal protective equipment, hazard pay, and enhanced sick leave so they don't have to choose between their lives and their livelihoods. And we know paycheck protection would provide guaranteed income to keep aggregate demand as high as possible and provide relief for those who desperately need it. Moving beyond the immediacy of the pandemic, we do look prospectively to the federal jobs guarantee that would provide a stable job to anyone who needs one, would help reemploy workers, ensure they are less vulnerable to the whims of the market in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ofronama, for an excellent presentation and for sticking exactly to the time. Sobering results, but hugely important. And I look forward to discussing your paper. Moving straight on to our second paper in the session, Bob McMaster from University of Glasgow is presenting his co-authored paper with three co-authors on health economics, social stratification, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Bob, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, and Happy New Year, everyone. I hope it's a better one than 2020. And this is very much work in progress, so one might say it's embryonic. There's two or three things I hope to draw out from the brief presentation today. The first one is that there's a distinction between prediction and explanation, and this can have potentially quite profound implications in terms of arguably policy advice and how we analyse or interrogate the nature of the pandemic. And I think this emerges from the second factor, is the relationship that's presumed between economy and society. I want to argue that standard health economics at best disregards society, or potentially in the extreme embeds society within the economic domain. In other words, treats all social interactions as if they were economic interactions, as conveyed via markets. By contrast, stratification economics offers something differently. What I want to do is argue that whilst the pandemic may have obviously a mirror with the financial crisis in certain respects, in that the financial crisis was presented as a Minsky moment, does the pandemic present itself as the health economics moment? And basically we argue that it doesn't in this paper. We argue that stratification economics affords us a much better basis in which to investigate the impact of the pandemic in socioeconomic terms as a health shock than certainly mainstream economics does. mainstream economics would argue has paid scant attention to issues of population health and indeed pandemics. If one looks at the popular health economics texts and indeed the the collection of works in health economics journals and books, collected volumes and so forth, pandemics barely feature at all until relatively recently, obviously. So we think the current pandemic actually, far from being a health economics moment, actually reveals the weaknesses in standard health economics. So in terms of the remainder of the time I have, I'd like to present the material in the following way. Stratification economics initially. I won't spend a great deal of time on this. I want to emphasize more mainstream health economics, albeit in a nutshell, how we reach our conclusions in terms of our argumentation and the limitations, albeit very briefly again, given the time constraint. So I think we're all reasonably familiar with stratification economics. It talks about how the economy functions in a hierarchical ordering. It talks about groups, whether that's by gender, race, and so forth, social class, for example, and how persistent inequalities are enabled or facilitated by institutional arrangements. We can talk about the mechanisms for this via exclusion and stigmatization, for example. And stratification economics, therefore, from our perspective, offers a considerable advantage in that it assumes that the economy reflects broader social values and power structures, certainly in a way that we would argue is not amenable to the standard economic approach. So if we were to interrogate the pandemic from a stratification economics perspective, we would obviously anticipate that the pandemic is primarily a public health shock, but nonetheless with quite profound socioeconomic ramifications, would have pronounced asymmetric effects. The existing institutional arrangements, power structures and so forth will afford those that are privileged in the social hierarchy better protection, and therefore may well lead not only to the persistence of inequalities as measured by wealth and income, but also by health outcomes, but may actually further exaggerate those differences. Moreover, the policy response, such as non-pharmaceutical interventions, primarily lockdown, I'm speaking from somewhere that's just gone back into a lockdown, second lockdown, will have an asymmetric impact again, in that the cost burden will not be evenly distributed. Specifically, the benefits, the principal beneficiaries in terms of life saved would tend to be the elderly, and this may well be the elderly wealthy, especially in the US, whereas those who are bearing the burden associated with the policy response may well be the young and impoverished. And indeed, I was just looking at the mortality rates for different conditions. This is relating to England only, and it's published by a Nuffield Trust. It argues and it presents this notion that the existing health outcomes are very unevenly distributed amongst the population, and this is also reflected in COVID-19. Now, if I turn now to mainstream health economics, this is by way of context. Now, mainstream health economics, we would argue, is best presented as being heavily utilitarian. In fact, Evelyn Forget in her excellent work has talked about this being the most neoclassical of mainstream approaches, arguably. It's heavily influenced by utilitarianism. It uses a consequentialist approach in terms of its economic evaluation. That is marked by its utilitarianism and indeed Paretianism. The individual is also analytically privileged. Health economics doesn't ignore institutions, but it assumes a particular institutional form as conveyed by the market. Each relationship, principal-agent relationship between physicians and patients, is essentially a market-type relationship. What we would argue is that, and following some works in the literature, is that the Grossman model from the 1970s, which is essentially a human capital approach, is heavily influential in shaping the subsequent trajectory of evaluation techniques and indeed health economic theory. This conceives as health as a stock. An individual is born with an inherited stock of health capital. This is subject to the aging process, which is akin to depreciation, argues Grossman, and this invites individuals to consider investing in this stock of health. Individuals will only invest in the stock of health if it produces benefits. Therefore, the whole health issue is very much one of an individual's responsibility, and also part of a cost-benefit algorithm. Essentially, it becomes an issue of constrained optimization, essentially. So a pandemic, for instance, will change the costs and benefits that go into this calculation. Now, the Grossman model, as originally conceived, in effect endogenized the whole issue of one's lifespan. So an individual would choose, effectively, it would be rational for an individual to choose when to die, when the costs of investing in their health stock way outweighed the benefits. And this would be a reflection of increasing costs associated with the aging process and diminishing benefits and so forth. So to bear that in mind, the Grossman model essentially presents a Cartesian dual, in that we have this rational individual who's viewing their body essentially as a machine in which to invest. If we can turn now to economics in the pandemic. Now, what is notable about the pandemic is that the number of economic contributions has increased, and this has been in some respects quite refreshing. There are a number of recent analyses of the COVID-19. There is a survey, for example, that tends to suggest that most economists feel that there is limited, if any, trade-off between lives and livelihood. In other words, protecting the economy. And that tends to suggest that there's some recognition that public health is a prerequisite to a functioning economy. There are also increasingly sophisticated...
Bob, you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you. That there are increasingly sophisticated macroeconomic simulations that attempt to at least assess distributional impacts. What of health economics? Is this akin to the Minsky moment? Well, we would argue no, but health economists have tended to rely upon cost effectiveness analysis and the promotion of utilitarianism. We have John Appleby, a quote from John Appleby in an editorial in one of the health economics journals. He is essentially articulating the view that utilitarianism is an adequate basis on which to provide an analysis of the pandemic. We also have other contributions from elsewhere, Chilton and colleagues, for example. Now, to progress things, in terms of a Grossman-informed approach to health economics in this issue of the pandemic, what we would find would be that the pandemic, yes, would be modelled as an exogenous shock. And of course, it would alter the costs and benefits of the individual's constrained optimization problem. And this is where it gets interesting in terms of it would be rational, given that the costs are unevenly distributed, it would be rational for the poor and the comparatively less well-educated to disinvest in their health. In other words, we can come to the prediction, the same as stratification economics, that there would be divergent effects according to income and wealth in terms of individuals' responses, the mortality rates, and so forth. But this is where prediction and explanation part company for us. Health economics says nothing about a social class or underlying power relations or the institutional implications or the institutional arrangements rather that result in the predictions generated by the Grossman model. It's all a question of rational optimization. Now, as a consequence, policy implications may well be framed in terms of trying to nudge people into particular forms of behavior, trying to change the cost-benefit calculus, as opposed to addressing fundamental social influences that produce those institutional arrangements in which health inequalities are manifest. So by contrast, we would argue stratification economics allows us to consider a broader range of social factors that will impact in the course of the pandemic and the response to the pandemic. Therefore, the previous speaker talked about employment circumstances. That would be very much within a stratification economics perspective as far as we would see it. Lack of possibility of working from home. We're part of a privileged group that can work from home, precariousness of income, and so forth. Also policies, my colleague Gerry, who's also in the panel, thankfully, also has written quite extensively on this and how the policy response can exacerbate existing health inequalities. So we come to the unfortunate conclusion that standard economics, whilst it's utilitarian in its endeavours and its underpinning a philosophical approach, attempts to capture the greatest well-being. Because of its crudeness, unfortunately, it's unable to do so. There is a supreme irony in all this. I will stop there and thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you. I love the framework, and yeah, I'm one of those people that uses the old 1972 health economics model. So I really need to follow your paper closely in future work. And you set the stage very nicely for our next paper, which is going to be presented by your colleague, John Davis. And this paper is on stratification economics and the pandemic effects on care provisioning. So John, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to just try to make sure are my slides showing correctly?
Yeah, perfect. Yes.
Oh, amazing. This paper is with my colleagues Merve Burnazoglu and Zohreh Emaami, and we are going to talk specifically about stratification economics, pandemic, and care. So much like Bob's presentation, we have this framework that we work with. The economy is structured so as to sustain a hierarchical order of social groups, especially race and gender in the case of the United States and to a large extent the UK. But the particular social groups that one might work with depend upon the social context, the nation, the social experience. And then we also argue that this ordering of social groups is sustained through micro level mechanisms, and we'll talk about how they work. And then in the context of the pandemic, we consider this a shock event that rather than moderate worsens social group inequality. So we are essentially going to translate standard economics reasoning into social group stratification reasoning. So here's the framework of our argument. We focus on the pandemic effects, how the pandemic affects care provision by its effects on both paid and unpaid care work and care workers. We distinguish two economic effects, one on paid care workers and one on unpaid care workers. So these are essentially effects on individuals because that's how economics in its data collection process expresses effects of events such as pandemics. But we then go on and translate these economic effects into social stratification effects. We identify for the particular analysis that we're doing in terms of care work, 3 particular social groups. And we then look at how the pandemic affects the well-being, the status of those 3 social groups. There's many different social groups one could examine, but in this particular setting, these are the ones we do. And then we talk about those micro level mechanisms in terms of stigmatization and social exclusion. And I want to, when I get to that discussion, briefly link this to how economics talks about discrimination and segregation. So very briefly, I want to identify who we're talking about. We talk about care and care work as not necessarily an altruistic activity, but one that is devoted to the well-being of others, particularly less able to carry out maybe adult activities or full competency activities, and people who are vulnerable. Could range from people who have issues of illness, children, the elderly, and so forth. We use a relational understanding of care. And so our argument is that care is a social provisioning, and the micro level interaction that involves that provisioning is best understood not as an arm's length market kind of interaction, but as a relational analysis. But we won't talk about that here. So Ofronama, pardon my pronunciation, gave a very nice talk about essential workers. We're talking about one category of social workers, and she had interesting comments to give about the particular essential workers in healthcare, although we also include people in social work and in education. And then, of course, we're going to talk about both paid and unpaid. So I'm going to be fairly quick here, given the time. The paid care workers, as you can see, are in the top group. And so in order to talk about what data and evidence we're hoping to be able to marshal to make our arguments, it's the top individuals, not individuals, paid care workers and other sorts of essential services. And then what are the economic effects that we expect to find for paid care workers? First of all, uncompensated increases in workloads. So this is including people in health, education, and social services. So workloads increased, compensation, no. And then if that's a short run consideration, a long run consideration is this, that once you are overloaded in terms of your work responsibilities, the career ladders and promotion and opportunity for change in career and profession that most people anticipate over work life cycles are stalled out. And so this connects again to Ofronama's occupational crowding argument. Unpaid care workers, who are they? Well, essentially people in the home, but also community members and people in volunteer work. And then these are the folks that we're not talking about. There's people who are connected to care, but they're not either directly involved or they have a more distant community responsibility. Economic effects. So these are, again, people in unpaid care. If you think about the home and the community, neighbors, people in the household, increases in workload, especially associated with higher levels of complexity in responsibility. So now mom is also a teacher, etc. And all the things that were customarily involved in the traditional household division of labor are suddenly shuffled and tossed up and reset by the higher levels of responsibility. And so again, if that's a short run effect, this is a more long run effect. Crowding out for those unpaid care, people working in unpaid care, of not only, and this is I think an especially important issue, labor force participation, both in short-run employment and in long-run life cycle opportunities. And then let's not forget that people have other goals besides labor market, personal interests, concerns, ambitions, and community and social relationships. So this is the economics affects what we traditionally study in economics. It's associated because that's how the data is organized in terms of what happens in individuals. And now we move on to the three social group, social stratification effects. So we focus first on lower income care workers of color. In health, I think that's fairly identifiable with people who have the less educationally promoted sorts of opportunities. In education, I think that's similar. And so I think is if you heard Darrick Hamilton's talk on our first night in the plenary, and if you heard Sandy Darrity's Armageddon talk the other day, really a fundamental issue here are racial gaps in not just income, but especially wealth. And then of course that implies well-being as well. So broadly reinforced racial division of labor. Now, there's many women, particularly white women, who have had the benefit of higher education. And so there are still pandemic effects on this particular group. And we focus on women because many white men, doctors and so forth, have a really different social group position than higher income care workers. And here what we argue, what we expect to be able to demonstrate is a reinforcement of the traditional glass ceiling, a capping out. And this, by the way, this social group effect has to be seen in terms of both paid care work and unpaid care work. If your domestic responsibilities are increased, then your capacity to work in paid care or paid work of any sort are worsened, class ceiling reinforced. Broadly, worsened household gender division of labor. And then lastly, for women in general, employment stagnation. I think there's tremendous evidence on this. And again, reinforced gender division of labor. So I'm fairly close here. I want to talk about the mechanisms. We argue that there's two principal mechanisms, and I want to distinguish these. When we talk about stigmatization, it's within relationships between members of different social groups. And so if you have a white male employer and you're a woman of color, then there's an interaction there, and there's a type of mechanism that works basically through the ability of the privileged individual in the employment situation to bias the interaction with the person who is in the subordinate subaltern role in the favor of the advantaged or privileged individual. So if you look at stigmatization literature, especially Bloom's work, as Sandy Darrity emphasizes, it is a targeting by social group identity. Whereas when you talk about discrimination, you're talking about a tool that works upon individuals. Now, it has as a underlying foundation stigmatization, but the discrimination, I think, when we talk about it, obscures sometimes the discrimination obscures this how stigmatization by social group identity works.
John, you're at 10 minutes now. You have 5 minutes left.
Good, right there. So here we have this micro level mechanism, and our basic argument is, I noticed, as I said at the outset, is that these mechanisms sustain social hierarchy. They, if you have a social event such as a pandemic, a shock event, these mechanisms work to worsen or at least reinforce those social group relationships. And so broadly here, when we talk about stigmatization, As you can see, I've listed these outcomes as the general effects. So this is, again, to emphasize the within relationships type of story. Exclusion, we think, works differently. Access, you can't even sometimes enter into interactions with people of privileged social groups. So it's an access limiting type of mechanism. And the way it works is to give access to desirable economic relationships to individuals from dominant social groups and restrict access for individuals from dominated social groups and limit them to the less desirable sorts of economic relationships. So the whole sorting, occupational crowding argument that we heard in the first paper is involved. So again, in standard economics literature, people talk about segregation. And segregation arguments, we argue, are formulated in terms of individuals. But really what is going on is a social group story, a practice of exclusion for large numbers of people by social group identity. And it works, as we know, most seriously through occupation, but educational limitations of opportunities for individuals is fundamental and crucially important. And then you can see the outcomes here. Again, those gaps. The gaps are what we talk about when we look at social group inequality. When you look at much of the current income inequality literature, it is formulated in terms of the size distributions, in terms of deciles or percentiles of individuals, obscuring again social group relationships. We think that when we talk about social group inequality, you need to use this language of gaps, not just a size distribution analysis. So we close the presentation with the concept at the very bottom of this little grid. Nancy Folbray has made important arguments about the care penalty. So we're interested in interpreting care penalty in a socially stratified economy from a social stratification economics approach. And you can see that for the analysis that I've gone through for our paper with my co-authors, those two mechanisms are what combined at the micro level to produce those social hierarchies. And then what comes of that? The values, as the last paper emphasized, and the power relationships that they reflect. So our social values in our society are at two levels. They're what standard economics represents as a fair market process, and what a stratification economics approach presents as a set of power relationships based on this set of reinforcing mechanisms that produces a society, a social group hierarchies. And so that's how we think ultimately the care penalty, our society's inability to provision care properly ought to be understood. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, John, for your excellent presentation, highly relevant. And I'm already starting to see some questions, both from Bina. Thank you, Bina. And we'll get to your questions shortly after our final two papers.
I'm trying to get out of here.
Pardon?
I'm trying to, did I stop sharing?
Not yet.
Let me see. I know you still need to stop sharing.
Oh.
So go to the top.
I have it there.
Okay. All right. There we go. Excellent. Okay. Next we have Sayema Khatun talking about recession stimulus package and protection of women and gender in COVID-19 pandemic response in Bangladesh. And Sayema, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Session Chair Yana Rodgers. Good morning, distinguished delegates and participants. The topic I'm going to present is recession stimulus package and protection of women Gender in COVID pandemic response in Bangladesh. As Bangladesh has entered into the fourth stage of coronavirus infection, by the first week of April, the massive community spread has begun. The infection curve raised sharply up, and the government of Bangladesh has implemented a strict nationwide shutdown. Public healthcare system has been appeared as thoroughly broken and had been completely collapsed during the outbreak of the pandemic. Due to this public health emergency, about 13 million people's job went at risk in June 2020, which is approximately 20% of the domestic labor force. During the extended lockdown, the government has unveiled a massive stimulus package worth $8.573 billion to mitigate the ravaging effect of global COVID-19 pandemic on the macroeconomic stability, which is nearly 2.52% of the country's GDP. It targeted to revamp economic activities by boosting liquidity, sustaining business operations, slashing unemployment. Nearly 3.5 billion bailout package has been available for the industries and service sectors, and $2.53 billion has been provided for small and medium businesses at the concessional interest rate. Affected industries and service sector would receive working capital through banks as low interest loans, as the commercial banks would provide the amount as loans from their own funds to the concerned enterprises on the basis of blank client relations. So now I will talk about my research problem and method. I argue that these stimulus packages by design are not able to contribute preventing loss of livelihood, income, to ensure social security of women significantly, especially in the areas of the informal sector, self-employment, and wage work. I have started with the doubt that stimulus packages and unprecedented macro credit scheme do not have leverage to mitigate the poverty and pauperization of women as the consequence of lockdown and economic downfall. Women's dual responsibility in marriage and market has restricted and shaped women's labor force participation. I assumed that nature of these packages would be unable to reach out women for the existing systematic gender inequality, especially across the ownership of property and business. It is obvious that women have not been able to access to the benefit primarily for their gender-based hindrance in banking channel, as stated in Jasmine Jaim research, and formal economy. And secondly, their structural disadvantageous position in trade and commerce due to their limited social mobility, access to education, and domestic role as wife, mother, and caregiver, everyday experience of sexual abuse in public and private space, along with escalating risk of rape and post-rape murder, including domestic violence. All the factors combined constantly keep women in a subordinate position and systematically prevent them to participate in trade, business, job, employment, and other income-generating activities. I have briefly examined the extent these stimulus packages and programs have been accessible to women as captured from the ground level reality they're living in with qualitative method, having remote conversation with 10 relevant women living in the capital city of Dhaka and Khulna, including small entrepreneur, banker, government sector activist, journalist, and academician from April to December 2020. Taking the opportunity of online broadcasting trends this time, I have also attended the major webinars, research findings, disseminations, presentations, dialogues, and talks on impact of COVID-19 on women as an audience took place in Dhaka during this period of my data collection. I'm illustrating the impact of this macroeconomic policy adopted to restore economy on women's life, consequential feminization of poverty, and call for recognition of structural disadvantage of women in the formal sector if, in the context of pandemic mitigation. So I'll move on to the scenario of loss of livelihood, creation of new poor and women. A new set of poor population has emerged during the shutdown of business income generating activities for health risk of COVID-19 pandemic, in which the large number are women and children. Many left city for high living expenses and returned to rural areas for agriculture-based activities. An estimation by a Dhaka-based think tank, Center for Policy Dialogue, indicates that poverty rate could be as high as 35% as a result of COVID-19. An additional 17.5 million people could have fallen into poverty. Now I will discuss about the nature of the stimulus packages and the structural disadvantage of women. The contribution of women's work and participation in formal economy is hidden but huge. We have only few studies indicating the unseen bottom of the iceberg of women's work. The nature of the stimulus packages is based on boosting of economy, mostly in informal sectors via banking channel that is socio-culturally inaccessible for women. The stimulus packages has built upon the boosting of macro economy that categorically marginalize women as economic subject. Women rarely have bank accounts or receive bank loan and can operate independently without support from their male family members. As culturally prescribed role of caregiver bestowed upon women in the families and nursing and health service, women are more exposed to coronavirus through their gender role and obviously are getting less medical attention and care. In spite of the evidence of male as more prone to corona infection, as medical anthropologist Paul Farmer indicates, corona infection as another caregiver disease. Women as caregivers are likely to be more vulnerable in the pandemic through the caregiver role. Sexual and domestic violence has been escalated during the indefinite lockdown in the country. Rather than challenging and playing any transformative role, the packages are contributing to reproduce and intensify the existing gender inequality and feminization of poverty, maintaining the status quo and discriminatory gender norms and a male-dominated economy. Now I will talk on my field experience, women's reality as lived in the pandemic. Raihana Sultana, a female assistant vice president of a leading private bank, has never personally experienced any female entrepreneur as recipient of any large loan while operating her long banking career. She only knew a woman who received a bank loan of Taka 2 crore, that is in US dollar, 117,812 US dollar. While having conversation with a generation of new generation women entrepreneur, Taslima Mizi, the owner of a Desi leather brand, Kutiba, stated that it is difficult to measure the loss of women entrepreneurs because of the nature of women's work and their contribution in economy. Women entrepreneurs in Bangladesh have been engaging mostly in small and medium enterprises, that's called SME. It is very rare for women to run a heavy or large-scale corporation as the owner. Thus, the recipients of the large loans through banking channel are invariably male. As in my empirical observation in the field reveals, facing the financial hardship and loss of income, middle to low middle class educated women have become visibly active from home base during pandemic mandatory homestay. Numerous female-led startups have slowly proliferated as online business and e-commerce, where people have started to sell products and services from home, converting their individual skill and traditional family crafts into marketable products with a small investment, typically from family and friends.
Sayema, you're at 10 minutes. You have 5 minutes left.
Thank you. I'm almost there. Online platform-based stores such as Facebook offering flexibility in shopping experience with small investment without spending for commercial space and utilities. Home has become center of new business trend, using the residential space and avoiding commuting outside home. Many women are quitting their formal jobs and earning better than their previous job that involved childcare support. In spite of a disadvantaged situation in many challenges women have emerging in SME, especially in ready, processed, and homemade food, clothing, sari, decorative items, handicraft, beauty, jewelry, and fashion industry, usually made by few individuals with a small support team in urban areas and homestead-based agriculture-based business in rural areas. The growing trend among the middle and lower class educated women running online business from home base has been widespread in the city, suburb areas having nationwide internet access, especially via cellular phone network. Many of them launch season-based merchandises for the large religious, cultural, national festivities as Eid al-Fitr, Eid al-Adha, Durga Puja, Pahla Falgun, Pahla Boishakh, and Vijay Diwas, and so on. I have not had an opportunity to find a real-life women entrepreneur who have received the stimulus package, though there are some data available on women getting the benefit. Perhaps for my social distancing and managing life myself in pandemic, multitasking as a caregiver, homemaker, and anthropologist, playing double burden has impeded me to meet such one. So I will conclude by saying that stimulus packages intended for the large industries, keeping the small and medium sectors at margin, left limited impact for employment generation, especially for women. Access to the packages for women as entrepreneurs has been particularly difficult. Government should have measures to protect women in SME and informal business, monitoring access of loan and easy disbursement via Bangladesh Bank. Economic recovery plan must consider the gendered nature of the market, integrate policy strategy to support women in center of the framework, not at the margin. Understanding women's role in economy could be the key to boost economy from inside out. That's all for my presentation. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you very much, Sayema. So the final presentation is my own. So I need a timekeeper. I think Elaine, you said, can you spare 15 minutes or do you need to go?
Sure.
Okay, if you can warn me at 10 minutes and then again at 14 minutes. Thank you. So now I will do share screen. And here's my presentation. And let me do from the beginning. All right, I have this annoying thing at the top. There we go. So this is a co-authored paper on the future of work for domestic workers in the US, looking at innovations in technology, organizing, and laws. And Elaine, who is also part of our panel, is my co-author on this paper. And we are focusing on domestic workers, as we've been learning about in this session today, who are, many are considered using Ofronama's terminology, essential workers in close proximity to the people they are caring for. They are indeed paid care workers, and data show, and we will show also, they earn some of the lowest wages in the country among all occupations. There's more data coming out that domestic workers are subject to a number of violations of worker rights, and we'll show some data on that also. And this isn't only a worker rights issue, it's also problematic for the people that domestic workers are caring for, because it reduces the quality of care they can provide. And these concerns around the treatment of domestic workers and their pay are gaining more and more attention as our population is aging. And this is a global issue also. And more caring labor is being outsourced to paid workers. And in the US, and this is again consistent with some of the other presentations we've been hearing, most domestic workers are women, many are women of color, and about a third of domestic workers in the US are born abroad. And this is higher than any other occupation. And the growth of the gig economy has also contributed more to some of the insecure nature of the work they're doing. And as we've been talking about this morning, there are additional issues that we need to think about during this pandemic, especially for paid care workers and particularly for migrant domestic care workers, those who have come from abroad. Domestic workers have, as we've been hearing about, getting less access or less priority to personal protective equipment. Many experienced job losses, either that or they had to keep working without proper PPE. They have been excluded from the federal relief packages as well as from many state packages. And those who are from abroad are often in a legal limbo. If they lost their job in the States during the pandemic, some were not able to return home because of travel bans or lack of funding to be able to get back home. So what we wanted to do in our paper was to use a qualitative approach. We do use interviews like Sayema and her methodology, and wanted to see what domestic workers and their advocates and domestic worker groups are doing to proactively try to improve the working conditions for domestic workers in a collective fashion. So we are going to focus on 4 areas in which we've seen substantial innovations in collective action for improving the terms of employment for domestic workers. And these 4 you see listed here: Domestic Worker Bill of Rights campaigns, new digital platforms, better efforts to prevent wage theft, and then new collective bargaining strategies. So in terms of collective action, which is one of the main themes of our paper, the collective action efforts among domestic workers go back to 1881 with the famous, by now, washerwomen's strike in Atlanta, which was predominantly Black women demonstrating and protesting for and going on strike in an effort to get higher pay and better working conditions. Despite their efforts and other similar kinds of strikes and protests, domestic workers continued to be excluded from some of the biggest pieces of legislation in the US that protects other workers. In particular, the Social Security Act, which provided most other workers pensions and unemployment insurance, the National Labor Relations Act, which allows us all to organize and bargain collectively, and the even bigger legislation, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which covers wages and hours. Domestic workers were excluded from all of these. Until 1974, finally, Congress amended the Fair Labor Standards Act, and gave most, but not all, domestic workers the right to earn a minimum wage. Casual babysitters were exempted, and importantly, live-in domestic workers. And this was not changed until just a few years ago, 5 years ago, when home health aides, personal care assistants, nursing aides, and other professional caregivers were finally included in the right to earn a minimum wage. So that's just remarkable that only happened 5 years ago. We still do not have national legislation preventing wage theft or punishing employers for not paying adequate wages. Kamala Harris has proposed, and we'll get into this later, a national domestic bill of rights, which would carry some of this legislation. There was also an amendment in 2016 to prevent wage theft, but this did not move past the committee stage. I'd like to next turn to some data from the CPS showing the surge in demand for domestic workers, and looking in particular at the different categories of domestic workers. And then some stats on the demographic composition of domestic workers. And finally, some examples of the kinds of violations of labor standards that they experience, as well as how their wages compare to other workers. And all of these poor working conditions, low pay, poor enforcement has led to an upswing in collective action, and that is what we focused our interviews on. So this next slide, again, is data we put together on domestic workers from the CPS for 2003 to 2019. And the 5 categories of domestic workers we focused on are shown below. And it's quite clear that by far the strongest growth in domestic workers in the US has come from home health aides, especially home health aides who work for agencies. That's the sky blue bar at the top. There's also been some growth, not much, in non-agency based health aides. So it's really coming from the agency-based health aides. The number of house cleaners has stayed in absolute terms about the same in this whole period, and it shrunk in relative terms. The same is true of nannies. And the number of home daycare providers for children has actually gotten a little bit smaller in absolute terms. So the key story here is agency-based home health aides on the sharp increase, absolute terms and relative terms. Some striking figures here for the US. 92% of domestic workers are women, compared to 46% for non-domestic workers in the US. And you can see also a much lower share of domestic workers are US born compared to non-domestic workers. So we have well over a third of domestic workers in the US who are not born in the US. And finally, the majority of domestic workers are non-white. About 60% of domestic workers are non-white compared to a little bit less than 40% for non-domestic workers. So domestic workers really stand apart from other workers in terms of their race, ethnicity, and their nativity and gender. And here you can see the breakdown by the different categories of domestic workers. And I think what was interested here and where it really, a group that stands apart is house cleaners are very low percentage US born, much lower than the other categories. Most house cleaners are born abroad, and that is different from the other groups. Similarly, most house cleaners are also non-white, and that percentage is also far different from the other groups. So there is quite a bit of variation among domestic workers in terms of nativity and race and ethnicity. In terms of labor standards violations, in a nutshell, it's pretty much wages, wages and compensation.
Yana, you're at 10 minutes and you have 5 more minutes.
Okay, so problems with not getting paid for overtime and not being paid the minimum wage. And here we can see the wages of domestic workers are quite a bit below in real terms and in nominal terms compared to all other workers. And this gap has been persistent over time. So what we did was interview 10 leaders of 10 nonprofits that are known for advocating either directly for domestic workers or all low-wage workers and immigrants in New Jersey. And we did these interviews about 2 years ago. And we did some additional interviews with leaders of 2 organizations that have new digital platforms to organize domestic workers. They are named Up and Go, that's a worker co-op in New York City, and Karina in Washington State, that's a partnership with their local union. And we looked at 4 types of innovations. First is the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. There are now 10 states and 2 cities, including Philadelphia and Seattle, that have passed and have already implemented a Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. They vary across the state. Every state has a unique story, but typically include the right to earn a minimum wage, even for live-in workers who often have violations, the right to a break, the right to protections of their personal property, and finally, the right for enforcement of their contractual standards. There's a number of campaigns in other states, including my own state and Elaine state, New Jersey, where our Center for Women and Work has been involved in doing some surveying of working conditions in New Jersey for domestic workers. And as I mentioned, our incoming Vice President Kamala Harris introduced a national bill just 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. A key stakeholder in this is the National Domestic Workers Alliance that was formed in 2007. A second area of innovation is new digital platforms. Notably, Philadelphia's Bill of Rights included a new platform called ALIA, which has a portable benefit system in which workers can accumulate paid time off even if they work for multiple employers. Seattle also had a portable benefit system, and these 2 cities are setting the stage for having worker-centered digital platforms that go well beyond care.com and older platforms, which really benefit the employer more than the employee. And there's been other innovations from Up and Go and Karina, which unfortunately I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go into. The third innovation is more efforts to prevent wage theft and to allow workers to recover lost wages and to penalize employers who engage in wage theft. And some of this is included in the newer Domestic Worker Bill of Rights legislation, also called 2.0, and including worker organizations in labor standards boards has helped to implement this kind of wage theft recovery. And finally, some innovations in collective bargaining. There's a growing literature about how difficult it is to organize domestic workers. They work, in invisible locations. They're often isolated. So one strategy to help organize domestic workers is to include a sectoral bargaining approach and to have boards in Domestic Worker Bill of Rights where domestic worker representatives are on the boards as well as employers. So closing up now and summarizing what we've learned about today or talked about is a surge in the number of domestic workers in the US, really led by home health aides. What we learned in New Jersey, which does not yet have a Bill of Rights, is that it takes a strong organizational campaign to pass one. And that has been a key lesson from those other 10 states that did pass their worker Bill of Rights, very strong campaigns. Our interviews really highlighted the potential for hugely helpful worker-centered digital platforms buttressed with strong nonprofits locally that work with state governments, local governments to develop alternatives to protect domestic workers. What we did in our center was collect data, original data for New Jersey on the working conditions and wages of domestic workers. More of that's needed. There's so many states where we just don't have that information. And finally, as we're talking about today, COVID-19 has really heightened the attention paid to health workers, and health workers include home health workers and home health aides who need additional protections in the context of COVID-19. And with that, I will close. And let me do stop share. And let me see, I think, Ofronama, you are next. I'm gonna need to get a little drink of water. I know I'm discussing your paper, but I'm going to step off for just a moment to get a drink of water. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Ofronama, if you can discuss the paper that Bob presented. And you are muted.
There you go.
Hopefully I'm able to be heard. Thank you so much. I really appreciated Bob's paper and the contrasting view of standard health economics and how it prioritizes individuals. It takes a utilitarian view, among others. And the contrast with stratification economics, which sees the economy as functioning as hierarchical ranking of social groups, and one that's really reinforced through mechanisms built into the economy. I'd be interested to learn more about how the standard approaches have been inadequate in our current policies. You mentioned the lockdowns, so I'd love to hear what you see as the alternative. At least here in the US, there's been very little support financially given to workers who lost their jobs or are still working. And, you know, I know in other countries, there's been a lot more support given on a monthly basis. You know, there's one stimulus and then one, I guess some people got it this weekend, but that was pretty much it. So I'm curious to hear what your view is about the alternatives to lockdown as a standard policy and other ways that you believe workers should be supported, and reflecting on that from a stratification perspective. So thank you.
And thank you. I think, would you like to respond, Bob?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for your comments and your support, the supportive nature of them. It's a very interesting question you pose about the whole issue of lockdowns. I think there's a macroeconomic dimension to this. I've been looking at a few webinars involving MMT, modern money theory, and how supporters of MMT feel vindicated about macroeconomic stimulus and so forth. I think the lack of institutional support for lockdowns tends to lead to their ineffectiveness, and perhaps this is manifest in the US, in that if people do not feel they are adequately supported, the same happens to some extent in the UK. If people feel they're inadequately supported, either to isolate following contact tracing, or they just can't afford to stay at home, the lockdown, the effectiveness of the lockdown is going to be ultimately defeated. So one could also take another approach in that, from a more public health perspective, perhaps the Western economies, Western governments have not learned the lessons from East Asia, certainly from my understanding, where lockdowns have been rather less numerous in their nature, and certainly there are fewer restrictions on people, people's movements and people's ability to interact with one another in many East Asian economies, and that's simply because of their public health approach to the pandemic. I'm struck, just as an aside, it was a few months ago that apparently Vietnam, Singapore, and Taiwan recorded fewer instances over a weekend of COVID than the White House in Washington, DC. And I think that illustrates the efficacy of policy in different parts of the world. I'm not entirely sure I've addressed your point adequately. It's a very rich one, and I think we would have to analyse the institutional arrangements underpinning the application of lockdowns. To some extent, this may well also be amenable to a stratification economics approach, in that lockdowns necessarily are demanding of a collective sense of responsibility, which may be inadequately supported in some parts of the world.
Thank you for your response. And to continue with you, Bob, I believe you are discussing John's paper. Did I get that correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. I really enjoyed this paper, and I think it's incredibly enlightening in terms of its examination of social stratification effects on the provision of care, especially its investigation of micro-level mechanisms, specifically stigmatization and exclusion. What I'm going to concentrate my comments on, well, and in this respect, I think the term gaps was very informative in terms of inviting us to focus less on the individual household, and more on social groups. But what I intended to focus on were two aspects. One was the allusion to crowding out, which I appreciate comes from a arguably more mainstream analysis. What I think crowding out could also be aligned to this notion of a care penalty, which I think is very interesting. To take the latter, I would perhaps rephrase this as a caring penalty, given that the analysis is on the provision of care, specifically the delivery of care, or care activities of varying hues. There seems to be a caring penalty here, and this has been alluded to by feminist economists. Julie Nelson has talked about how her work with Nancy Falbury was rejected from a mainstream journal. It might even be in the Journal of Health Economics. I can't recall off the top of my head. In terms of, well, there's people who are involved in caring work receive non-pecuniary benefits from the provision of caring work. In other words, it's altruism. The altruist also benefits. This seems to have a legacy within the mainstream approach, and one could perhaps talk about a caring penalty in that respect. Another way, I think there's been a a caring penalty, especially during the pandemic. And one I don't think you allude to in the paper, unless I've missed it, is that many of those frontline workers are suffering from the fatigue, quite profound fatigue. I noted the other day that in London just now, I see intensive care unit staff have gone from a 1-to-1 ratio of staff to patients to a 1-to-4, such has been the demand placed on them. And of course, the task demands per patient don't change. There's just been an increase in stress associated with this. And there's also an increase in the likelihood of contracting the virus from frontline staff involving. Is this also a caring penalty? And it seems to me this caring penalty can perhaps be framed in a more supply side approach. This relates to the provision of care, and how this relates to a more overarching analysis of a care deficit presented by John Tronto's work, whereby we lack the resources to adequately address caring needs. And that seems to me to have some certain resonance during a pandemic. And it might be worth exploring this notion of a caring penalty vis-a-vis a care deficit in developing the paper.
Okay, thank you very much for your comment. John, would you like to respond to those comments?
Yes, I'll respond briefly. The gaps topic, there we really talk about economic well-being, particularly net worth or wealth. So that's largely, if you will, an economistic sort of perspective. The care penalty topic, when it was formulated by feminists, was really formulated in terms of social values. So you may recall, I went through the slides fairly quickly. When we talk about essential workers, generally we talk about economic sustainability, but when we talk about care workers as types of a special type of essential workers, we talk about ethical and social sustainability. And so our goal is to not just talk about how an economy continually perpetuates social relationships between different social groups, but also succeeds or fails in this normative sense, social value sense, when we talk about whether or not caring remains a supported activity, or as Fowbray and Nelson emphasize, always suffers a penalty in market economies, socially stratified ones in particular.
Thank you, John. And you are on next also to discuss Sayema's paper.
I really like Sayema's paper, pardon me again. She's taking us beyond our Western-centric focus to the global South. And she begins really with the concern for feminization of poverty. And she has a fairly direct set of causal factors. She talks about micro, small, and medium enterprises as where women are especially employed and involved. And she also talks about, and this goes to Ofronama's emphasis on proximity. That's another causal factor that Sayema notes. So in terms of social stratification, social group analysis, she has a very pure opportunity because Bangladesh is ethnically and religiously quite homogeneous. In fact, in age distribution in the age pyramid, a heavy concentration of younger individuals. So when we try to do social stratification, social group analysis, one of the real challenges is intersectionality. So we may see wealth inequality by race and wealth inequality by gender quite differently, though of course individuals can be of a given race and a gender. And so it's hard sometimes to make arguments in more complex cases, but she has a nice opportunity there where, however, I thought there was significant social group differences. If I'm correct, in Bangladesh, most of the population, the majority, is in the villages, and Dhaka is a very large population, obviously. Bangladesh is a very large population, but still the difference between urban and rural must be important. And I'll just do a shout out for Sayema's field. She's an anthropologist. Maybe anthropologists do a better job than economists, and we toss in sociologists also doing a better job perhaps. So thank you for your paper, I really liked it.
Thank you, Sayema. Would you like to respond?
Yes, of course. Thank you, John, for your comments. That was really helpful for me. And you know, the paper is since it is anthropological in nature, so I have not captured the. Though I have a general picture of Bangladesh, but I haven't couldn't capture the comparison between the rural and urban areas. So I worked in the city of Dhaka mostly. So the people I talked are mostly urban women from middle or lower middle class background. So this is really interesting that being an anthropologist, I am trying to engage with something that is not in my area, which is the economical activities and in the field of economics. But since I am working with the qualitative data and qualitative ethnographic interviews that help us to have a deeper understanding of what is going on in the ground level reality. That's what I was trying to capture in my brief paper. Thank you very much for your comment.
Okay, and then I believe, Sayema, that you were the discussant of the paper that I presented.
Right. I thoroughly enjoyed the paper you and Jant, written by you and Jant. It was interesting in many respects for me. I haven't it has provided a comprehensive picture of what is going on in a field of the domestic work in the United States that has not much talked about issue in mainstream discussion. I haven't come across such paper on such topic before this one. So it has provided a pretty comprehensive picture in terms of background of the domestic work sector, though it is trying to deal with the future of domestic work. So it is, I have really liked the part that dealt with 4 innovations that are the emerging trends in how the domestic worker agency can be understood. So it is really interesting to look at that and the 4 innovations, especially the digital platform and the collective bargaining was really illuminating for us. But I was thinking about, I was curious about knowing some real people, voice of real people. If it could be possible, could have been possible to include some the voice of the actual domestic worker, how they're experiencing, what they're going through in real life, that will connect with the data and the table and connect with the real people's experience. That will be really interesting and helpful. And since it has dealt with a lot of statistics, also we could have focused on. I'm also interested to have the difference between the states. There must be differences among the states. What are the conditions of the states? We might have get example of few states to understand what is going on in the ground reality. So I will stop here. Thank you for a beautiful presentation.
Thank you, Sayema, for those comments. To briefly address your 2 points, we did interview workers as part of a survey in follow-up work that the center that I helped to direct, Center for Women and Work at Rutgers, did, and we've posted that to our center website, but their comments in the survey largely reinforce the interview results that we did with the organization leaders. Very consistent with each other. And in terms of differences across states, I think one interesting example would be New York versus New Jersey. They're adjacent states, both, close proximity or directly, related to New York City. You'd think that New Jersey would have a domestic worker bill of rights, but we don't. And one reason is because New York, and especially New York City, has much higher share of live-in domestic workers, and it was live-in workers who really needed the Bill of Rights. Whereas for a while, organization leaders in New Jersey felt that more domestic workers in New Jersey had multiple employers and were not subject to the same kinds of violations as live-in domestic workers. So the push for a Bill of Rights wasn't quite as strong in New Jersey in earlier years, but it's gaining momentum here. So that would be one example of state differences. And let me see, I'm charged with discussing Ofronama's paper, and then we have some questions from our participants also. I loved your paper. I think it's a really important contribution. You have probably seen and read the paper by Michelle Holder and Tom Masterson and their co-author on race and gender in the US during COVID-19. They focused on sectors hard hit by job losses and work closures and how that predominantly affected Black women in the US, whereas your sectoral approach is looking at essential workers. So it really contributes nicely, and fills that gap that hasn't been looked at yet, given this paper, the other paper that's coming out in feminist economics. So I really like to focus on essential workers. And where I think as you revise the paper and get it ready for submission, what I'd like to see is a more formal discussion of the methodology for what are the sectors that have more essential workers, which occupations they are. Right now it's relegated to an appendix, and you made some changes to the classification system that you mostly relied on. I think if you can have a bigger part of your contribution come from developing a formal methodology for classifying what is an essential worker. And there must be, other groups by now that have done a similar kind of analysis of essential workers. And maybe you could do a little comparing, contrasting, and then coming up with best practice for what is an essential worker. And similarly for your categorization of high proximity, whether or not you could consider that as part of this single methodology for an essential worker and have different categories by proximity, kind of combining those two. So I think instead of briefly mentioning the categorization and where you got them from, I think developing that in a self-standing methodology section would really be interesting. And that's all I have on the main comment on your paper.
Thank you so much for the comments. It's very helpful. Yeah, I would say revising the sectors or the categorization was definitely a big part of the work, and just making sure, for example, that like there were occupations that ended up falling into essential that really shouldn't have been, that were pulled out, like hairstylists in a hospital somehow, you know. So just, you know, yeah, there was a lot of work that went into excluding certain occupations to ensure they were not listed as essential where they may have been included otherwise. So I appreciate that feedback and the idea of making that, putting that out there in the forefront even more. So thank you.
Good. All right, well, we have 5 questions in the Q&A, and the first couple are from Bina, and the first one is for Bob, and the second one is from John. So I assume everyone can read them. I don't think I need to reread the questions. So Bob, do you want to go first and address the first question from Bina? Do you see the question, by the way, Bob?
Yes, I do. Thanks.
Okay.
What about the interconnectedness of health outcomes? Yes, absolutely. We should go beyond stratification. Absolutely. But I think our point about stratification economics is it offers us far more advantages than standard health economics in the examination of this quite profound event. And I think the pandemic itself, just to reiterate, the pandemic itself, I think, illustrates the limitations of the standard approach in examining the health and our economy.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. John, you have the next question from Bina.
Yes, hi, Bina. I think I understand your question is how do we analyze the impact of the pandemic? And our prior conceptual view is that in a socially stratified economy, the well-off, when everyone is worse off, when the whole society is worse off, the well-off shift the burden to the dominated social group. So that's our prior conceptual view. But in terms of the analysis that you're asking for, first we have to have the identifiable economic effects, and then we need to make an argument about how aggregates of individuals, namely social groups, are ill affected. So their standing as social groups is worsened. So that is the framework. I'm not sure I'm answering you according to what you're looking for.
Thank you, John. And I think the next couple of questions are for you also, or your co-authors, Patrick Lapid's question and Stephanie's question.
Okay, I'm reading Patrick's. I don't think we have done the point that Ofronama emphasized about close proximity. We haven't used that. We did a sectoral analysis of education, health, and social service workers. We're still down in the weeds with the data, but I think that you make an important point about the harm of exposure as fundamentally important. And so, of course, we'll have to talk about a particular social or national setting. And should I answer Stephanie as well?
Yes, please.
Hi, Stephanie. Exploitation. Well, I think it's an important concept. We use when we talk about stigmatization. So this would not be exclusion, in my opinion. Exploitation applies to interaction between people who have advantage and people who are disadvantaged. And the difficulties with the exploitation concept is that, of course, with its Marxist heritage, it involves a particular sort of transfer from disadvantaged to the advantaged. But in social interaction in the workplace, for example, stigmatization, I think in the stratification literature is particularly taught to me by Sandy Darrick, emphasizes abuse and manipulation. And so if you think of our work settings as assigning us collections of tasks, well, if a woman is asked to go get the coffee for the guy who's sitting behind the desk, that's a form of abuse. I don't know if it's exploitation. Casually, it is exploitation, but more systematically, I think it's a stigmatizing a woman as having that sort of task. It's a assignment of tasks, that type of abuse, typically under the umbrella of intimidation.
Right, thank you, John. And my apologies to the attendees. I did not realize you could not see the questions. So I've been asked to read the questions. Bina had a question for Sayema.
Yana, Yana, this is Zohreh.
Oh.
Is it possible for me to respond to the questions directed to the paper John presented before we move on? Or
of course, please do.
As far as Patrick's question of proximity, I do think that the nature of both paid and unpaid care work is very much embedded in a very close proximity sort of work. And so it's it creates a particular exposure to the dangers of the pandemic. As far as Bina's question about the pandemic, I think my answer would probably be the same, in the sense that healthcare workers are highly racial and gendered, and they are particularly vulnerable in the pandemic. And my last answer would be to Stephanie, in terms of the place of exploitation. We have debated a lot about where the social category of class fits in the sort of the stratification model that we're studying. And I will say that I think right now we're in the frame of mind that race and gender are both sort of given to you at birth. Class is much more of a fluid kind of thing, and making those distinctions, even in the context of class and exploitation, is interesting, because it opens up the category of class to perhaps a deeper analysis of the place of race and gender in a class exploitive question, even in terms of the labor movement.
Okay, thank you, Zohreh. Let's see, Sayema, you had a couple of questions from Bina. Would you mind just, and I'm not sure now if the audience can see your answers, or if you could just briefly summarize what the questions were and what your answers were.
So first question from Bina. Thank you, Bina, for your question. First question was that is there any telephonic interview during the COVID situation, and why I did not use the survey results. Actually, I used the survey results in my paper, but while in presentation, I tried to focus on the qualitative data rather than the survey, since the nature of women's work in Bangladesh cannot be quantified. I have argued in my framework that I wanted to critique the numerical measurement of the economics use. there are surveys by World Bank, UN Women, and Center for Policy Dialogue, and BRAC. They are the large institutions who are conducting surveys in Bangladesh during pandemic over telephone and other remote ways. But they're also coming up with the data that we have large employment loss for both men and women. In a survey, there is data that 25% men has lost their job and 17% women has lost their job. But problem is the women's job is not formal. So losing of their income and job cannot be understood through this kind of survey. That was part of my argument. So I don't know if it is sufficient for Bina's question. Thank you, Bina.
Thank you very much, Sayema. Let's see, Bina also had a question for me. What proportion of the domestic workers in the USA are men? In India, about 33% are male. If there are male domestic workers in the USA, how are they placed relative to women? In the US overall, about 8% of domestic workers are men, and most of that is coming from the paid health workers, the home health aides, especially agency-based. The lowest proportion male is among nannies. Nannies and home-based daycare providers, something like 2% are men. In the CPS, the cells are just too small in terms of sample sizes to be able to do a breakdown of, say, wages by gender among domestic workers. So I'm not sure, but I would suspect that male domestic workers on average earn a little bit more than women, but probably not much more. It's an interesting question. As far as I know, the data is just not there because of small sample sizes. And then let me see, John, you have a couple of questions from Bina and from Stephanie also. If you can, John, repeat the question and your answer. And we have 3 minutes left.
So I think we're disappointing Bina in not having